we can begin to think about India as segments of India falling under what we might call the Persianate realm. We can think really of the period from about 1000, a little bit after 1000 to 1800 as a period of Indo-Persian. It is a fact that the first Persian language newspaper in the world was published not in Iran, but in Calcutta by Ram Mohan Roy, who is very often described as the father of the Bengal Renaissance. It
Good morning. Welcome to the first episode from the Academic Bridges series of the University of Tehran's channel. My name is Salimi, your host. In this academic bridges series, we're going to have academic interviews with various professors from all around the world. We're going to talk about culture, language, history, art, and literature. Today, our guest is Professor Vinay Lal, Indian historian at UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles.
Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me to share a conversation with you. I'm delighted to do so.
Thank you very much, Professor. Dear Professor Lal, could you please introduce yourself and explain us in detail about your scholarship expertise, please?
Yes. So let me begin with just describing my education very briefly, because that will give the audience some idea of the kind of background that I have, because I'm a rather unusual person in the academy, and that all my degrees are actually in a wide array of subjects, and I don't actually have a degree in any discipline. So I did my undergraduate and master's degrees from the Humanities Center at the Johns Hopkins University, where I studied literature, history, philosophy, and cinema. But the degrees are actually from the Humanities Center. And even though I'm a professor of history, as was mentioned at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, I don't actually have a single degree in history, because my doctorate is from South Asian languages and civilizations at the University of Chicago, which I earned in 1992. And since the time that I earned my degree, which was about 32 years ago, I have worked in a wide array of fields. So I was hired to teach Indian history, but I also teach courses on comparative colonialism. I teach courses on theory of history, philosophy of history, subject of inquiry, and that is courses on the politics of knowledge systems, by which I mean my principal interest is really trying to understand the various ways in which the academic disciplines work with certain categories to help organize our information and understanding of the world. And of course, these categories shape our understanding of the world. By which, so what do I mean by that? So I'll give you a very simple illustration. For example, the idea of growth is crucial to economics. If you had an economist who did not advocate for growth, he would probably not be hired by any university in the United States. Okay? But growth is a category of thought. Okay? And so what I try to understand is, what are the categories through which disciplines actually organize the mass of information and data that we have about the world? And what are the presuppositions of these knowledge systems? And then what are the risks when ideas generated in one culture about how to think about, let's say, sociology or anthropology or history, those ideas then become normative for every civilization, which is effectively what has happened in the world with the domination of Western knowledge systems. Right? So that's really what I work on in a way.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you very much for this in detail explanation, Professor. So maybe I would ask my very first question, about India and Iran. And my question would be that, what do you think of the Persian influence on Indian civilization and culture? And do you have in general any examples to give to us?
Oh yes, I think that the Persian influence, the word influence of course is one of these words which is very wide in scope.
Definitely.
But I think there's no question that the Persian influence on Indian culture, art, architecture, in vast domains of life has been profound. I don't think it is an exaggeration to say that in some ways from around the beginning of the second millennium, so shortly after the year 1000 CE, we can begin to think about India or segments of India falling under what we might call the Persianate realm. Okay, so we can think really of the period from about 1000, a little bit after 1000 to 1800 as a period of Indo-Persian, the Indo-Persian period of history. So now, what would be some of the illustrations, some of the highlights of that? Well, it would take volumes and volumes to describe what is distinct about the period after the early 1000. That is the influence, obviously, of the Ghaznavids, and the fact that under the Ghaznavids, Persian already started becoming rich. So what you have after the year 1000, particularly with the beginning of the establishment of the Delhi Sultanate in 1206, so even before 1206, you had Muslim influence in northwest India especially, but beginning with 1206, with the establishment of what is called the Delhi Sultanate, we begin to see the spread of Persian. So Persian really becomes the official language of, I would say, every Muslim court in India, more or less. Most people are only aware of sort of the relationship between the Mughals, because the Mughal Empire was the grandest empire, really, that India had in the second millennium, and perhaps the grandest empire in the world in some respects, certainly equivalent to the Safavids in Iran, for example, and the Ottomans. So most people are only familiar with the relationship between the Mughal Empire and their attempt to increasingly Persianize, Indian culture. But the story really goes back much earlier to the Delhi Sultanate, and then it goes back to the 1300s when one ruler called Muhammad bin Tughlaq basically expelled the entire population of the capital city of Delhi and moved this population down 1,000 kilometers or more down into the Deccan, that is into South India, where a person called Gangu Hassan broke away from Muhammad bin Tughlaq's rule and established a new kingdom called the Bahmani Sultanate. Now, these sultanates in the south, in the Deccan, from 1350 for the next 200-300 years, all of them had extensive links with Persia.
Exactly.
Okay. With Iran, and the stories in some cases are really quite remarkable, because at least in one of these sultanates, we can even talk about actually the fact. So I'm here referring to the third Sultan of Bengal, a man by the name of Ghiyasuddin Azam Shah, who ruled from 1390 to 1411. Now he had established links with all the leading thinkers in Persia, and he actually had a long correspondence with Hafiz, the great celebrated poet. And they jointly actually wrote a poem together, which has been published. It's actually included in Hafiz's Diwan. All right. So here's a wonderful illustration of this kind of congruence between Indian and Persian culture. And in these Bahmani sultanates, it is fair to say that So when I say these Bahmani sultanate, originally it was one sultanate, and then it broke up into a number of different Deccani or sultanates of the south, which you distinguish from the Mughal Empire, which is largely based in the north, but then of course, they, eventually it extended down to the south as well. So the story, however, is also one of some tension because the local population, they're called the Dakkanis. They try to promote a Dakkani version of Urdu. The more Persianized people, including the foreigners who had come to these sultanates, they're called the Afakis. That is, these are the cosmopolitans who spoke Persian. So sometimes there was some tension between these two. Okay, but on the whole, it's a story of remarkable cosmopolitanism. Okay,
Professor, it was all the points you mentioned were very interesting, and honestly, the fact that you mentioned Hafiz, because Hafiz for us is one of the greatest poets Iran has ever seen. We, in general, I don't know, well, one of the examples I would just make to say, for example, at Yalda night, which we celebrate, we actually open his book and we kind of want to have his opinion on actually our desires, our wishes. So anyway, as he's one of the greatest poets in our history, that point was very interesting, honestly. And also the fact that you say that we had the kind of Deccani version of Urdu, and that was amazing. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. So my other question, Professor, would be about your opinion on the precisely on the intellectual history between Iran and India, if you have any points, any insights.
Well, there are enormous aspects of that history. I mean, let's just take one example, which shifts the period that we're talking about now to, let's say, the early 19th century. Okay, so it is a fact that the first Persian language newspaper in the world was published not in Iran, but in Calcutta by Ram Mohan Roy, who is very often described as the father of the Bengal Renaissance. And he published the first Persian language newspaper anywhere in the world. It started publication in April 1822, and the newspaper was called Mirat ul Akbar, Mirror of News. In fact, the city where he lived, Calcutta, actually by the late 1820s, by the 1830s, had a handful of Persian newspapers. And I'd like to remind you that the first Persian newspaper that was actually published in Iran was not until 1837. It was launched by Mirza Saleh Shirazi. It was simply called the Kagaz-e-Akbar, that is the newspaper. So that's 15 years after the first newspaper, Persian newspaper in India. It is also the case that up to the 19th century, more Persian literature and more Persian books were published in India than in Iran itself. Okay? And ironically, it is the beginning of mass printing, which also contributes to the decline of Persian in India. This is something that is very little understood, because the consequence of that was that when popular printing, when the printing press really becomes quite common, then other Indian languages also start getting published. Books and newspapers start emerging in other Indian languages, and that actually leads to the decline of Persian. There was, of course, an official role that the British played in the decline of Persian, because Persian was, as I said, the language of every court. The British also used Persian as an official language along with English, but in 1837, by an official ruling of the East India Company, which was now ruling most of India, the use of Persian as an official language was actually abolished. Okay, but interestingly, in Hyderabad in South India, where there was the Nizam of Hyderabad, and he was the head of one of the most prominent Muslim courts and families in India, there the use of Persian continued officially until 1886 when Persian was replaced by Urdu eventually, okay? So really until around the end of the 19th century, the Persian influence is really quite paramount and visible. But your question is really about the larger intellectual histories that link Iran and India. And I think I'd like to give an illustration here which takes us into the 20th century. Yeah, sure. And that is the illustration of Rabindranath Tagore. Now, Rabindranath Tagore was the first Nobel laureate from Asia in literature. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1913. And at the ripe old age of 71, he went to Iran on an official visit in the year 1932 during the months of April and May. Now that visit is really an extraordinary visit in the history. It's an interesting chapter in the history of Iran, India's intellectual links. Before I describe very briefly Tagore's visit, I want to make a couple of larger points so one understands the importance of that visit and why that visit is important even today. One of the things that both India and Iran must remember about themselves, it becomes easy to forget that now because we are living in the age of the nation state, okay? Nation states are very narrow entities in many ways, but Iran and India are much larger than nation states. And when I say larger, I mean, of course, not physically as such. What I mean is India and Iran are both civilizations, right? And civilizations are much richer entities. Yeah. Now, Iran and India had links, as I've already suggested, that go back 1,000 years, okay? At least 1,000 years. And here I'm not even including the coming of the Zoroastrians to India after Islam became the dominant religion, of course, in Iran. Because if we include that, then we're talking about roughly 1,400 years, right? Because we know that the world's largest Zoroastrian population after the Muslims' conquest of Iran, the largest population is going to emerge in India, and India still has the largest Zoroastrian population of the world, although the Zoroastrian population overall is very, very small now. Yeah. But even if we exclude that and just take the period from 1000 CE onwards up to the present, that is 1,000 years, these two countries, these two civilizations had enormous exchanges. One of the most fatal consequences of colonialism is, and this is only an illustration, that countries such as India and Iran forgot the kind of links that they had with each other. They entered into a period of amnesia. This happened all over the world where people got colonized. Everything was routed through the West. So Indian intellectuals, Iranian intellectuals, for Iranian intellectuals, for example, Paris becomes very important, just as an illustration, you see, okay? For Indian intellectuals, the only thing that existed was London in the 19th century during the colonial period, right? They forget the kinds of links that they had with each other. And it's in that context that we have to think about Tagore's visit to Iran in 1932, because he's trying to reaffirm these links. He's trying to remove this amnesia, okay, that has fallen upon colonized peoples, such as Indians. He's also trying to affirm a civilizational ethos, because he could see the ugly turn that nationalism was beginning to take. In 1932, let's not forget, is just 1 year before Hitler assumes power in Germany. And then, of course, in 1939, you have World War II. And what are these wars? These are really wars of extreme nationalism in many ways, right? Where every country is. So he is trying to affirm a civilizational idea, and he wants to suggest that this visit to Iran is very important because he's trying to root everything in a kind of an Asian ethos. And he says very clearly in a letter to a friend that Persia is much closer to us in India than any other Asiatic civilization, you see, okay? Now, I can really elaborate upon this at very great length, but I hope that my listeners will understand what I'm trying to suggest here when I say that this intellectual history, right, has so many extraordinary chapters. For example, I didn't even mention, just to give you one last illustration, that the founder of the Mughal Empire was Babur. Now, Babur, 1526 is when the Mughal Empire gets established. So Indian miniature paintings borrowed heavily, of course, from Persian miniature painting traditions. And of course, I think that perhaps the supreme artist of that tradition was, of course, Behzad, right? Kamaluddin Behzad, working in the late 1400s and the early 1500s. Now, the cultural milieu from which Babur came was the Persian milieu. Okay, it's Turkic too, because he speaks Chagatai Turkic, and one of the things that happens is that as we go along after Babur to people like Akbar and Jahangir and Shah Jahan, in fact, actually under Akbar, Persian became the official language of the Mughal court. And we find that his son, Jahangir, is more fluent in Persian than he is in Turkic. But if you go back to Babur, what is the cultural milieu from which he comes? It's painting, music, poetry, the Charbagh garden, the four-part garden where the four paths, the four axial paths meet at the center. And very recently, just 10 days ago, I was in the North Indian city of Jaipur. I went to Albert Hall, where I saw what is acknowledged everywhere in the world to be the finest example of the Persian garden carpet. Massive carpet. The Charbagh Persian garden carpet, extraordinary. This carpet goes back to about 1634. And even the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, which has a massive collection, the first thing they tell you is that the best example of the Persian garden carpet in the world is this one, which I saw 10, 12 days ago, right? So, where does one begin when one begins to think about the Persian influence in Indian art, history, and culture?
Yes. Professor, thank you for all the explanations you actually gave us. I just had myself, if I permit myself to add something, well, anyway, I shall also mention that as a PhD candidate in Indian Studies at the University of Tehran, when you're talking about these things, I'm actually, remembering, the things that I have studied, and I'm sure that this type of conversation is very interesting as well for the Iranian audience, because we're talking about Iran and India, and this is something interesting. So I just wanted to say that, yes, about the Mir'atul Akhbar that you said, I personally have heard about it, but little. That, you said that it's a Persian language journal which was published during the British colonial India, and it was founded, if I'm right, and actually edited by Raja Ram Mohan Roy. And let's say the other thing that you mentioned about Tagore, that he had a visit in Iran in 1932. I was doing a research about the Zoroastrian high school in Iran called Firuz Bahram. Firuz Bahram is one of the oldest high schools in actually Iran and in Tehran, and it actually had various graduates with high level profiles in various aspects. Let's say many of them went to academia, many of them became statesmen. And it's very interesting to mention that in 1932, as far as I have read, when Tagore came to Iran, he was present also at the opening of this high school. And I think that is something very interesting. So practically when he came, I think that he did various things, and which among is being present at the opening of that. And maybe here also my last point, Professor, for me, Taj Mahal, and I'm sure for many, many other people, Taj Mahal is one of the main symbols, cultural symbols of India. And I was personally, fascinated by the fact that this Taj Mahal was actually constructed by the order of Shah Jahan, and for his beloved wife Mumtaz Mahal, which was anyway a woman with actually Persian roots. So I think that, as you have well said and explained to us, and I am very grateful for all these explanations. I think that really Iran and India have very, very let's say connected roots together, which makes the let's say mutual history very fascinating to read and explore. And my last, let's say, question here before the conclusion, Professor, is that, in your opinion, what is the difference between the Persian and British influences in Indian history? I know that the question is very vast in general, but maybe any insights that you have to give us about these two Persian and British differences?
Yes. Well, as you've anticipated, it is a very, very large question.
Yeah.
But let me put it to you this way. Okay, so I think that you see, for example, you see, if you look at, so you had mentioned the Taj Mahal. Now, the Taj Mahal shows, by the way, the influence of Persian architecture too. It's not only Persian, though. It draws upon various styles, but the dome, the vaulted arches, this is more a Persian conception. Okay, and of course, just on this same note, the beloved gardens of Kashmir. I mean, all of these are basically based again on this Charbagh conception that I mentioned, which is Persian in roots. Now, Persian influence in India, in my view, was not. It was gradual, and in a way, the Persian element became deeply embedded and became part of an Indian ethos, you see, okay? And I want to insist upon that because I do think that the culture that came out of the interaction of indigenous cultures here, particularly Hinduism, and the interaction with Islam, what came out of that, which in North India we have a term for it, we sometimes call it the Ganga Yamuna Tehzeeb. That is to say that the culture of the Doab, the culture between the two rivers, the Ganga and the Yamuna, so that's the North Indian belt, okay? And there again, that's part of the belt where you see the Persian influence in all of these respects. You see it, for example, in the cuisine, okay? You see it in the architecture. You see it in the music, right? Now, in all these respects, Persian influence became deeply embedded. It became so much a part of the Indian ethos that it was not always apparent to later generations that these elements had come from outside. This, I think, I want to submit to you, is the principal difference between the Persian period and the British period. I see the British as a deeply colonial force. I do not see the Persian influence here coming through what we would describe as colonialism. Okay, yes, there's no question that the Muslims came as conquerors, so to speak, and that's the period of conquest. But the ways in which, for example, they Indianized themselves, I regret to say that the British never really sought to do that, because they always saw themselves as vastly superior, okay, to the Indians. And I think that this is one of the fundamental differences between what we might call the Indo-Persian period, which extends over several hundred years, as I've described, and the British period, which had more lasting consequences in some ways, but that's partly because it was pushed down on us, but partly, of course, because by the early 1800s, the world has moved into a different era of technology. So the kinds of the ways in which the British could expand their rule, for example, was very different than what you found really, let's say, during the time of the Delhi Sultanate. Right? We'd have to look at all of these things. But take a very simple example: British food. I mean, the British don't have a cuisine, frankly. I mean, they have one of the worst cuisines in the world, if you even want to call it a cuisine, right? I mean, there's really no such thing as an indigenous English cuisine. There's steak and kidney pie and boiled peas and boiled carrots and things like that. No Indian in his or her right mind ever ate that food, you see, right? But you know, if you look at North Indian cuisine, there you begin to see. So if you look at, for example, the culture of kebabs, and of course the culture of kebabs runs all the way from, you know, from West Asia, you know, from Lebanon and then Turkey, and going all the way east to, of course, to Iran, to Central Asia, to Afghanistan, in Pakistan, India, right? And so I'm not saying that you know that the kebabs are necessarily the same type that you find there, but there's a way in which we can think about Persian influence even in Indian cuisine, and that's really not true of the British. But the best way to characterize the difference is that the British never really sought to, in that sense, Indianize themselves. They never sought to assimilate themselves into the civilizational ethos of India. And I know that there are people who will say that the very early British acted differently. The point here is simply this, that I'm not giving a detailed analysis of 350 years of the presence of the British in India. I'm saying if you look at the predominant influence of the English in India, this influence, the British were really experienced, particularly, of course, when Indians become sensitized to the fact that, well, they need to be in charge of their own destiny. The British began to be experienced as a kind of an oppressor. Yeah. It's not clear to me that you know that the Persian element in Indian culture was ever viewed as oppressive in that sense. Yes. You see, I think it actually helped produce a wonderful civilization here too.
And also about the cuisine, you said, well, maybe I won't say that as an Iranian, definitely, but anyway, maybe having tried a little bit of the cuisine of some countries, yeah, as you said, well, anyway, the Indian one, which I have tried not very much, but I hope to do so, and the Iranian one is one of those actually cuisines in the world which I personally always suggest to my friends, my actually friends from around the world, to once come to Iran and try definitely the food. So this was one of the most important points, and thank you very much for having mentioned that. As the last part, as the conclusion, I would just ask, what is your illustration of the future of the intellectual exchanges between Iran and India?
Well, you see, I think that we will have to work actively to try to produce these exchanges, because I mentioned something before. This is a good time to reiterate it, which is that, you see, in the modern world, beginning with the mid-20th century, where did foreign students, for example, students from India, Iran, from Egypt, okay, from Nigeria, from Kenya, any number of other countries, where did they meet? They met in the metropolitan capitals of the West. They met in London, they met in Berlin, they met in Paris. After World War II, it became the United States. It became the major American cities, right? I am more likely to encounter an Iranian student in some ways at UCLA than I am at a university in India today. And so we have to really think about, as I said, the links that we had, how we lost those links. We have to put the relationship between India and Iran in the wider context of the global South. It is critically important that countries of the global South have exchanges with each other that do not involve the West. Everything does not have to go through New York or London or Los Angeles or Berlin, right? In fact, it's fatally important that it not go through these places. And so that's one of the reasons also I consented to this interview, because it's a direct conversation that I'm having with someone like yourself based in Tehran, okay, and with the University of Tehran. Usually these kinds of contacts do not really happen except when they're mediated through the West. We need to remove that mediation of the West, right? And this means that I think it's very important that we read each other's literature, for example, right? We read each other's literature. Hafiz, of course, is still read by, people who are really fond of poetry. But Hafiz is not the only one. There's Sadi, whose tomb is in the same city. There's Omar Khayyam. There's a number of other poets that I can really think of, including some contemporary writers as well, right? So I think it's important that we read each other, because what we find is that if you're an Indian, you're reading Indian literature, and then you're reading the literature of the West. If you are African, let's say you're Nigerian, you're reading Nigerian writers and you're reading the literature of the West. The Nigerian is not reading the literature coming out from Iran, okay, or Iraq, or Syria, or Japan, right? And the Indian is not reading that either. So the West is always one fixed nodal point, and then the other fixed nodal point is simply the country to which you belong. And that's, I think, something that has to change, right?
Yes, Professor, thank you very much for all the points you mentioned. And I just maybe permit myself to add another thing. I'm now a PhD candidate in Indian studies, and for my master's, I did Japanese studies. Nevertheless, I concretely understood that in order to be able to do, let's say, authentic research, we need to be able to read from the first-hand resources. So practically, we need to learn the languages, and this was actually why I always thought that learning languages is one of the most helpful things that we can do, specifically, let's say, human sciences students, because yes, unfortunately, when it comes to be translated through, in general, various languages, or let's say English, as you said, the Western, eye of, the point of view, it's completely fine to read that as well, but we need to have our point of view as well. This is why I do completely agree with you, and this is what we need to do. We need to grow and increase our mutual academic exchanges. And the last but not least, Professor, before finishing, in about almost 2 weeks, we're going to have Nowruz. Nowruz is our New Year's Day, exactly in Persian. No is new and Ruz is day. So for us, it will be in about 2 weeks. I just thought to maybe ask you if you have any messages, I don't know, anything that you maybe want to say, or I don't know, anything that you think you might say about Nowruz for our audiences which are watching you.
Well, just two things very briefly. One is that I talked about this man called Hasan Gangu, who in 1347 established the Bahmani Sultanate. And the one thing I can tell you with reasonable confidence from what I have read, okay, is that Nowruz began to be celebrated in the Bahmani Sultanate after 1347. Okay, so there's a long history of the celebration of Nowruz in India. And the second thing is, I wish you all a very happy Nowruz.
Professor, thank you very much for having been with us today. It was a real pleasure. And thank you very much for everything. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much for having been with us today. So that was practically the first episode of the Academic Bridges series from the University of Tehran's official TV channel. Please stay tuned with us, because this program is inshallah going to continue. And I wish you all a very good day and goodbye.
شبکه دانشگاه تهران، شبکه حکمت و فرزانگی.